Good morning, everybody. Welcome. You're all very welcome. There are still a few more seats if you want to try and work your way through. But from my point of view, from the panel's point of view, it's great that you all want to come. Standing room only is essential. How do we achieve 100% net zero carbon is a pretty good question. To date, 280 local authorities have signed climate emergency declarations and have made commitments to achieve net zero carbon. But how many know how difficult this is going to be? While I'm seriously grateful for groups like Extinction Rebellion and others to have created the atmosphere that has led to these commitments, do we as experts, and that includes all of you, know how to achieve it? That's why I think this next hour and a bit are so important. And my challenge to our panel is, can they empower you to go out and do it? The climate emergency is, of course, politically radical. And unless our current political economy can deliver 100% net zero fast, then the politics will have to get more radical. We have the legislation with the revision to the Climate Change Act requiring the degree to which the net UK carbon account for the year 2050 that must be lower than 1990 baseline is increased from 80% to 100%. We know that the failure to take action is likely to be catastrophic, and so any figures put forward as to the costs of taking actions are relatively academic, as there is no cost to assess if we fail to do so. While we cannot guarantee at the outset that any one pathway is the right one, we do have a great deal of research and practical knowledge to work with. The UK Green Building Council has produced a net zero carbon definition and guidance. The Committee for Climate Change produced its guide to net zero last May. And just 5 weeks ago, the LETI, the London Environmental Transformation Initiative, have produced, they produced a how-to climate emergency guide. Quite amazing that in the first week there were 6,000 downloads, which I don't think any government document has ever had. So last week, my local authority, that's Islington, published its climate emergency strategy and then discussed it in council 3 days later. And I was pretty impressed by what I read. Explained who they were, explained what they've done, and explained what they're going to do. But there was no talk about engaging the people or empowering the people of Islington. And this revolution, and it is a revolution, will not happen without cross-party, cross-sector, popular support. I'm happy to say that when I confronted the councillors with this, they completely got it. I'll wait and see what happens. Back in 2010, the government accepted all the recommendations of the Zero Carbon Schools Task Force that I had chaired. 2010 we're in. The government was looking for a technical solution to ensure that all new schools would be zero carbon by 2016. Yes, 2016. However, we followed Amory Lovin's adage that if you halve the demand, double the efficiency, and halve the carbon in the supply, then you're down to 1/8 of the emissions. We knew that if they put their mind to it, it was easy for a school to halve their demand and double their efficiency. But halving the carbon in the supply was going to be much more difficult as it was not in their control. And yet that's the one bit we've done, because the incoming government, the Secretary of State and his advisor, put the rest of it in the bin. As I said, this is political, as well as social, economic and technical. And I'm confident that our panel will give us a good run through the challenges posed by 100% net zero carbon and suggest what we need to do. So I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read their CVs. I'll just say who they are and the order in which they're going to run. So you need to think about your questions because we want to have a good question and answer session at the end, good discussion. So first up will be Professor Jim Watson from UCL with the title of What Does Net Zero Mean and What Are Some of the Challenges? Next, Claire Wildfire is a global practice leader of cities at Mott MacDonald, talking about how we build a net zero economy in the built environment. Then Greg Chowdhull, the Chief Operating Officer from Carbon Free Group, talking about we cannot afford not to achieve net zero carbon, but who will bear the costs? And who will receive the benefits of the transition to get there. So the economy is coming through all the time. Brownie Turner is Climate Services Development Manager of Space for Climate, and she'll talk about climate risk disclosure and what are the financial and asset impacts of physical climate change. And finally, Keith Clark, Chair of the Forum for the Future, Constructionarium and the Active Building Centre, among other things, will talk about the skills issue. So without more ado, Jim.
Thank you very much, Robin, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to give the big picture overview about what net zero means and some of the challenges, particularly that are relevant to the built environment. So first, most of you will be familiar with the Committee on Climate Change's advice published last year, which Robin mentioned, which the government accepted. One of the big challenges is that, unlike the previous target, net zero really means a transformation of our entire economy. There isn't a bit of the economy where you can say, right, I'm now hiding from the need to reduce emissions, because there is no place to hide anymore. And this graph shows the emissions that would be left in the view of the Committee on Climate Change if we got close to meeting net zero. So on the left-hand side, you've got the emissions left. It looks very different to the emissions mix now. What dominates that is two sectors, air travel and agriculture, which account for most of those emissions, which is those sectors where it's really hard to reduce emissions to zero. On the right, because we need to get to net zero, we have to also remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere through technology, through planting trees, through managing the land better. And just to give you a flavour of what happens to the sectors which have most of the emissions right now, those are 2018 figures, so power has to go from 65 million tonnes to 3 in 2050. Buildings from 88 to 4, and surface transport, the big one, from 115 to 2. So across all of those sectors, it's a massive challenge to implement. Second, if you look at the history, you'd be forgiven for being an optimist about this. We're almost halfway there, and we're almost halfway there in two senses. One is we're halfway there in the period from 1990 to 2050, this year. But we're almost halfway there in reducing emissions. Our emissions reduction this year is going to be something like over 45%, so we're almost at 50 already. I think the issue is that we've done the easier things, decarbonising power, some of the efficiency and some of the economic restructuring. Much of the hard work is ahead. Decarbonising electricity is where we've made a lot of progress, and that's in sight now. We have more than 50% of our power from decarbonised electricity. This graph shows our energy mix as a whole, and it really demonstrates, although that's made some progress, the blue, the grey and the black are the fossil fuels, and we're still an 80% fossil fuel economy, so we've still got quite a long way to go. But as it says there, at least the first fossil fuel we started using, coal, in the Industrial Revolution, has almost gone. So we've made a very good start, but a lot more to do. So what about the future challenges? I'm going to focus more on challenges of the built environment, so buildings, heating, and innovation. So 3 points. So first, on the buildings, and I'm just focusing on homes here. This graph, again, is from the Committee on Climate Change, and it shows that, at least until a few years ago, we were making a lot of progress on energy efficiency. A lot of measures, hundreds of thousands of measures being put in every year across the building stock, efficiency measures like cavity wall insulation, solid wall and lofts. You can see, sadly, with this graph, as of a few years ago, the numbers fell off a cliff. and they are still off that cliff. So now we're at a rate of around 200,000 measures a year, according to the latest government data. So we really need to get to a point where that rate of measures goes back up again to something much, much larger, not just in homes, but in commercial buildings too. And that has very profound implications for supply chains and for skills and so on. So the UK Energy Research Centre, which I used to direct, has just finished quite a big project on that. And one of the big conclusions was just the profound culture change in terms of skills and the construction sector in order to deliver what's needed there. That's then closely related to my second challenge, which is low carbon heat. This is just a graph of where different countries, mainly in Europe, get their heating from right now. And I think it tells us quite a lot about why it's so difficult to do in the UK. So we're now on the far right-hand side of that graph. The green bar is gas. So we and the Netherlands and a few other countries have gas-based heating systems, whereas if you go towards the left, you get a lot more of a mix, more district heating, more electricity, and so on. So it says sort of two things. One is that we have a particular starting point, and that's really important to bear in mind. And the second is there's probably only a few countries we can learn directly from. And perhaps the Netherlands, which is right next to us, is one that we can learn from because they're being forced for a number of reasons to transition their heating systems much, much more quickly than we are. So hopefully they will be able to partly blaze a trail there. But my second point on low carbon heat is we don't really know what the answer is. This is, I don't know if any of you saw this, this is a rather obscure, as it turned out, film about the Battle of the Currents, which happened in the late 19th, early 20th century between inventors of different forms of electricity, AC power and DC power. At the time, it wasn't at all clear which one was going to dominate. Edison and Westinghouse fought it out, both technically, financially, and politically, about what was going to win. And I feel, in a way, we're in a new current war at the moment. You know, on one hand, we have people who are thinking, well, electricity is the answer, the heat pump on the left-hand side. Of course, that has lots of challenges with respect to the impact on the electricity grid and electricity investment. And then on the right, we have hydrogen, the new kid on the block. One narrative is that it's easy. All we have to do is change the gas, and people in their homes maybe change their boiler and nothing else changes. That forgets that the changes outside the house and the building are absolutely profound. We have to develop a whole new infrastructure for generating and storing hydrogen, and that means some very, very big investments. So it's by no means clear which way we do, but the one thing I would say is we need to do a lot more trialing, particularly on the hydrogen side, in order to get the data and the information that we need to make those decisions. And often they'll be at local level. Then my final point, just before I finish, is on innovation. So one of the things myself and colleagues did for the Committee on Climate Change last year was to look at what we could learn from history when it comes to innovations and how we meet net zero and the role of innovation in meeting net zero. I'm going to cover this very briefly. There's a report available on the Aldersgate Group website, which is a business group which convenes businesses, progressive businesses, on a number of sustainability agendas. So we looked at these 5 historical case studies, and our basic task was to say, what can we learn from past innovations of different types? Some of them are about consumer change, some of them about network and infrastructure changes, and some of them about purely technological changes. So, and they're not just within the energy sector. So I'm just going to cut straight to the conclusions to finish. And these are our recommendations to government. So first, we need more demonstration of these complex technological systems. So hydrogen systems, I think, is a very good example of that, particularly if we have to link that to carbon capture, if we're using methane to generate the hydrogen. That's something government knows about, but it hasn't put in place the capital or the policies to make that happen. We need to create markets if new technologies are going to come through. That's a really strong lesson from the successes in the power industry, the power sector. If we want those buildings to be low carbon, we have to create a low carbon buildings market. We kind of know how to do that, but again, it's partly political will to do it. Third, digitization. I think that's the thing that's really come up the agenda. So we have the ability to offer things like heat as a service now, new business models for heating, and melding digitization with the energy sector. That's where a lot of businesses are, but they really need that regulatory pull for it to happen. Using public organizations to coordinate, particularly when we're thinking about switching gas grids to hydrogen, or all the investment we'll need in the electricity grid in order to plug in our electric vehicles and move to electric heating and so on. Competitive advantage is really important. There are some of these areas where the UK can be really, really good. It can be first and can export products and expertise around the world. I think one of those areas is smart local energy systems. We have a lot of expertise here, but again, that needs to keep growing, otherwise other countries are going to steal a march and be first. And then finally, the consumer or citizen journey is absolutely essential here. If we get this wrong, we'll set back the transition by many years, if not decades. So I think getting that right is essential. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, now it's me. So net zero by 2050, that's a big thing. And the question is, 2050 is quite a long way away. So should we be doing stuff now, or should we wait till somebody tells us what to do? And in my view, the Committee on Climate Change report tells us an awful lot of what we need to know to get started. So I wrote a paper because I feel like the information is there, but we need to get it out there. And so because I'm at Mott MacDonald, which is a big infrastructure company, I thought about the whole of the infrastructure, but I'm going to talk you through more of the built environment flavours. And I suppose the thing is, the Committee on Climate Change has just got one scenario, but if you think about it, there's not going to be any magic bullet that we don't know about, so it will be some component of the things that we know about today. So first, what is the Committee on Climate Change telling us? So I'm starting with the built environment. Some of the things here are, well, it's majority about homes. So for example, no new homes connected to the gas grid from about 2025, then radical transformation of our heating systems, and by the end it's something like 30 million homes retrofitted with energy efficiency. So it's a significant transformation. Somewhere along this line, new buildings, there will be regulation about net zero for new buildings, but interestingly the Committee on Climate Change doesn't see new buildings as that much of a challenge. But we also do need to understand what's happening in the wider infrastructure. So adding to that, the decarbonisation of the gas and the electricity grid. So electricity-wise, that's massive new generation, and either a doubling or quadrupling of the power grid, depending on the answer to things like heat decarbonisation. So that will be happening at the same time in the built environment. And then also, as Jim said, there will be some solution for hydrogen. So there will be the generation of a hydrogen economy in some way. So where am I? Electrification of transport is coming. So no new combustion vehicles sold from, when is it, somewhere around the 2030. And to complete the picture, industry, decarbonisation of industry is going to be one of the hardest. So that's a challenge likely to involve clustering industry, creating the hydrogen as a solution for that. And finally, as Jim said, there's the sequestration angle, the fact that we're going to have to store some stuff, which is things like reforestation, but also technology such as carbon capture and storage. So this is big transformation. It's going to happen to us. And another interesting component of this is the amount that we will rely on behavior change is less than 10%. There's a sort of pure technology solution which is maybe around 40%, but around about half the solutions, we might find the technology solution, but it's going to have behavior change and acceptability associated with it. So the good news is, overall, Committee on Climate Change has suggested that the cost envelope is no greater than the original Climate Change Act target of 80% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. So we're in the same sort of cost impact. But in terms of the journey and the timescales, this thing, 3 decades, is that a long time? Not really, when you think about the lifetime of the assets that we're designing at the moment. So we do need to get on with things. And so that made me think about how we can picture what we have to do as an industry. So I thought about 3 strands. The first one is the clean energy revolution, which is basically the energy vectors as we know them, significant amounts of change. Like we've said, electrification of vehicles and potentially heat. Some of those things, that means built environment-wise, we are the front runners of making that easy for the public to create the uptake. And then energy demand. So this thing about the electrification as the broad answer with renewables as providing the decarbonisation, that's big. That is a huge amount of new infrastructure to build. It's 10 gigawatts per annum. That's a sort of falling off your chair big. So clearly, the curbing the amount that we're going to have to make that transformation in terms of the timescales, the cost, even just purely the viability, the feasibility of making this happen. That means that energy conservation is now a big time front runner. It's in our sights. And then finally, we've now got this finite endpoint, which basically brings into sharp focus the fact that there is going to need to be some mechanism for storage. So that is sequestration. The Committee on Climate Change predicts something like 1/5 of the land use should change to include energy crops, sequestration, peat reforestation. So there will be changes there, as well as the technology of carbon capture and storage. So circling back to that, oh no, not there yet, thinking about these 3 points in a little more detail. So that first one, the clean energy revolution, what does that entail? We now have a very clear indication that the answer lies in renewable generation, but there are some other points to play in this. So hydrogen has a place, nuclear has a place, bioenergy has a place. There is no single holy grail, so the answer will be a combination of those elements. Curbing the energy demand, I guess we know about that, but it's using everything in our armory, including digitization, and then, as I've spoken about, the sequestration angle. So there we are now, coming back to what does this mean? It's clear that government doesn't have all the answers. We have some of the answers. We can optimize some of the solutions. We understand that there are co-benefits like healthier lifestyles and also the skills. We've got the skills. There's clearly going to be a massive need, as Keith will talk about. So we do have some of the answers. And so in my thought, that's a thought about aligning our businesses towards this direction that's coming at us like a freight train. And that's where we can begin to, that's where we should start. So Mott MacDonald, as one of the leaders, this is my final slide really, has decided that we should step up. So we convened an infrastructure industry collaboration, which has input from the built environment at the moment through the UK Green Building Council. And we've decided to bring together a cohort of people to come up and meet government and help work out what the answers are. So there are a number of packages we're working on at the moment, one of which I'm absolutely loving because it's the decarbonisation of heat package. So that's pretty much it. I'm finishing on that call to arms, really, to come and join our coalition. So thank you.
Morning. I'm just going to talk a little about the costs and the benefits. No slides, but I'll just start firstly with the sort of technical side and hearing from some of the other speakers. Technically, we can do this, and we are already achieving net zero carbon on some projects. It depends what sort of projects they are. Are they residential? Are they industrial? And the company I work for is a community interest company, and we're working with a couple of different housing developments and are already achieving net zero. Now, commercially, that's the next point. It's a case of how fast we can do it. recognising sort of with green technologies, we're almost in a space of sort of Moore's law of computing. Twice as good, half the price every 6 months. So should we wait to do anything? And I would say to that, no. The sooner we can take action, the better, for a few different reasons. The sooner we can take action, then we're reducing the cumulative effects, the cumulative emissions of carbon out into the atmosphere. Taking all of the action, in 2049, is going to result in a hell of a lot more carbon being out in the atmosphere that's built into the system, lots more climate change impacts than if we can take action, today, even with small actions. So I'd say, don't wait. The technologies will get cheaper as we move forward. New technologies will come to the fore. The more that we can do, the more projects we can do, that stimulates the supply. So we're going to get there much quicker if we take action now. And there's no one answer, no magic bullet. We're not going to leave here, I suspect, and basically have one singular action that we all want to take, and we're going to basically get there and also solve world peace at the same time. It's going to be lots of little things that we can actually do. A suite of questions, a sort of decision tree. So when we talk about sort of net zero carbon, first of all, it's, what is the scope? Are we talking about all the embodied energy too? Because that makes a difference to if we just talk about operational energy and how we can look at the costs and who benefits from the paybacks on that front. Lots of organisations are working on just the operational energy first and then working it into their supply chain. And if that works for you, then that's great. It's just important to basically take some action. Where we look at the costs and the benefits, there's a difference if we're looking at new buildings, and there's a difference if we're looking at existing buildings. And also differences around sort of contracts, how buildings have been procured. If we're looking at residential, it's probably the simplest, where you've basically got owner-occupiers. If you pay more for an energy-efficient, zero-carbon building in operation, then you have less utility bills. A project that we worked on 10 years ago, actually, zero carbon building, even though it didn't hit zero, that was the aim, those houses sold for a premium. So basically, people were willing to pay more for an asset that cost them less to run. And that's what we're seeing now when we're selling zero carbon buildings that are a hell of a lot better, actually, than the ones that we built 10 years ago. In terms of finance, I think that, because this is kind of the sticking point really, in terms of, we know sort of roughly what the costs are. We can basically take a guess on what utility prices are going to do over the next 10, 15, 20 years, which would point us to taking early action now. We can also, we probably all know in the room that the price of carbon is far too cheap at the moment. And it's very, very likely that the cost of carbon is going to increase at a magnitude over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Lots of clients, local authorities, universities are pricing in carbon now at 50, 60, 70 pounds a tonne. We know that is a trajectory it's going to take. The government is likely to tax carbon, as they did with landfill tax, to stimulate better behaviour. So early adopters, early actions are going to pay dividends from that front as well. And then I think it's the accessibility to finance. Utilising green mortgages, borrow more money on the basis of having lower utilities, your costs net out to be the same. If we look at the same thing and roll that up several-fold, then we're looking at sort of green bonds and social bonds as well, where we've all got savings. We could be investors in this whole revolution as well as sort of users. Everyone's got a stake. So if we can wrap some of these green bonds up, sustainable finance, we're seeing this pressure come already from the finance institutes themselves with things like TCFD, the Task Force on Financial Climate Disclosures, through the sort of finance institutes, asking these sorts of questions. Green bonds are going to increase, and if we can use green bonds to really try to drive us towards zero carbon, publicly issued green bonds, with returns of 3, 4, 5%, many people, ourselves, will find that perfectly acceptable returns. And then we can do these projects at a scale where we get significant economies of scale. We can be involving local authorities and universities, big portfolio holders, to utilise the money within the green bonds and actually reduce zero carbon, both in new build and also in existing estate. So I've got plenty of examples of things that are happening. We're working with NHS, we're working with councils. Just literally this week, working for a council, giving evidence on climate change against a developer that wasn't doing enough in the eyes of the council. We won the case, and we're able to put planning conditions on the developer to make sure that they hit zero carbon. So this could be a binary thing, where if we don't take action, then you haven't got a business. You can't build what you want to build. You can't run what you want to build. There's stranded assets where if you're renting houses, whether it's houses or retail space or commercial space, no one's going to want to use that. No one's going to want to use your building, and you'll end up with these stranded assets and less action is taken. So there's the cost, the benefits, and also the costs and disbenefits of not taking any action. I think I'll leave it there.
Hi, my name's Bryony Turner, and I've actually put my affiliation down in my PhD student capacity, a never-ending PhD, some of you well know. And I think it's really important, just first of all, to talk about that, because what a PhD enables you to do is have some space for critical reflection, to absorb a lot of information, critically reflect on it, and think, what on earth does this mean for our sector? The day jobs that keep me employed include working for boundary organisations, Space for Climate, which is just over there, and I look forward to seeing you some later, where it's government, industry and academia working together to try and tackle these challenges, recognising, as we've heard, that this is not just a data problem, not just a technology problem, but it's actually how we go about our everyday working practices, the rules that govern us in our sector, but also as a society. And these boundary organisations are often project funded or on a voluntary basis. And so I challenge you now, before I go into my presentation, to say, should we be relying on knowledge dissemination, on bringing in new knowledge, on critical thinking and reflection, to be reliant on voluntary structures that can be got rid of at the snap of a finger if government funding goes? We've seen this already. We would have been well set up and further along in this agenda if we had still had all the mechanisms set up under the Climate Ready programme that the Environment Agency set up. There is some struggling along, like the London Climate Change Partnership. We're running a session on climate risk disclosure at 4 p.m. today in the Buildings Theatre, and we welcome all of you to join us. And the privatisation of organisations like CABE and BRE. I also belong to the CIBSE Resilient Cities Group, so there are voluntary structures in place by professional bodies. I'm not an engineer myself, and what's brilliant about that type of forum is it brings into the engineering profession other professions, other thoughts, to think about how we're going to tackle this. And the last thing I wanted to make before I go into the bulk of my presentation is to say, I suspect most of you here are from mainstream big organisations, developers, knowledge service firms, perhaps planners. Where are the small trades? How do we reach them? Where are the individual homeowners who are commissioning DIY projects or doing their own? Because those are the intervention points we're going to really need to bring this data and information to if we're to refurbish our stock and really hit these net zero ambitions. So I've compiled about 13 slides, which is far too many for the time I've got. But that's because these slides are going to be made available after this, and I've made sure they're hyperlinked. So there's a lot of resources, a lot of material. And a challenge for this sector is not deciding when to act or to start acting. We already have acted. We've got projects. Our difficulty is how do we scale and mainstream this? And that's what this kind of panel and this kind of discussion at Future Build needs to be tackling and having an open and honest conversation about. We've got a Climate Change Act in this country. We're talking about the amendment now in 2020, but it was established in 2008, and it includes adaptation to our changing climate as well as mitigation. I'm delighted to see that there's some younger members of the audience here, because this transition and what we're taking about whilst we rumble away trying to work out how we're going to do it is going to cross several childhoods. And those are buildings, both homes, workplaces, and school environments in which those young people are fulfilling their childhood. So we've got to think not just about the end goal and how we reach it, but also the transition periods. A little bit difficult here so I can see my slides and stay on track. So what I wanted to point out on this slide is we've heard the Committee on Climate Change be mentioned many times already in terms of zero carbon. They've also done a lot on preparing for climate change. So that's the climate change we're already anticipating based on the failure globally to act. So there's a level that we are going to have to cope with, are already seeing. And so we need to make sure that our buildings, our homes, workplaces are actually climate resilient at the same time as tackling a net zero agenda. And I would add that they should be healthy places in which we can all flourish. These are not add-ons or optional extras. This should be what we are aiming to achieve. So now I'm going to talk about a driver that isn't policy, that isn't regulation, that isn't your voluntary decision to act. The investment chain is on this, and you're all in the built environment profession going to end up with the investment chain asking you, what are the physical risks to climate change? When you are thinking about your net zero solutions, have you also thought about the physical risks posed, and how are your solutions tackling both the physical risks posed by climate change and the net zero agenda? And that if the investors are asking that, that then will translate to a value change. So I'm going to now skip over these slides, but some of you are going to need to take a big, deep think about this, because if we change our underlying way which we value homes and buildings in this country, that really will provide a financial incentive. But why wait till the market finally gets there? So Task Force on Climate-Related Risk Disclosure is actually what's driving the financial institutions. It was started in 2015, the investigation into it. Then 2016, the recommendations have been published. And they're looking at both the physical impacts, as I said, as well as the transition risk. The UK has a green finance strategy. Come to our session at 4 p.m. to hear from Bays directly, but the government set out expectation that for all listed companies, that's all listed companies, that's not just financial companies, developers, build-to-rent providers, etc., and large asset owners to disclose. You've got to disclose in line with those risks by 2022. This is also then underpinned by the Bank of England signalling it will stress test investments for climate resilience and start to bring in regulation on this. So whether or not you like it, whether or not you choose to act, the investment chain, the market has finally caught up since 1992, you could argue, from the UN Convention, and it will push you to act. And what we want is the focus to be on actually what are the innovative solutions, because we have that ability in this country. HSBC will be at our session later, but this is just to give you an example of banks already disclosing, and they flag the building and construction sector as a transition risk sector, that they bothered to actually, as a sector, go into detail on it. So there's a big reading list on the TCFD, and I think everyone should be making sure they're up to speed on actually where the investment chain is headed with this. There's also a huge amount of material out there. As I mentioned already, there's projects that have already deployed and used the climate change projections to both tackle low carbon and carbon reduction measures, as well as physical climate risk. So if you don't know them, you need to get up to speed with them. Many of them were done started off 10 years ago. So we've got a problem with learning in this sector. And so before I go into solutions, because I think there are some issues the sector needs to tackle, but I'm not just here to moan, because I really think we've got amazing capability in this country. I just want to say that we mustn't be silo thinking. We need to be thinking about healthy air when we are thinking about these low carbon interventions. There is no point in creating an airtight, meeting some kind of calculation credential if you then find the building's overheating, so you need to end up putting air conditioning in because there's no other way to cool it, and or if you actually create an air quality problem because people are actually living and breathing indoors. There's work that's been done on the APBBG for healthy homes and buildings, and I just want to draw your attention to the recommendation 3.1, that the practice of improving energy efficiency without due consideration to the consequences for health should be thought about and ended. The RCPCH came together, so Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health came together with the built environment sector to look at air quality. Climate change is flagged as one of the risk factors. Have a look at the indoor air quality. Cyber resilience. If people are starting to work more from homes, some of the ways in which you can enable cyber resilience are things like partitions. You need to look at the partition rules and materials that go within them. So that could be a good intervention point for us, that we offer a dual functionality, reaching net zero and providing cyber resilience. But we also need to be cautious that we make sure that we're thinking in this kind of way and horizon scanning, because otherwise we could end up with a lot of lost embodied carbon if we're having to rip up and start again. I think we're very close to heading towards not being, oh, put my hand up, we're working on a circular economy, but actually having to justify obsolescence. That's a huge change in our sector. It's a huge opportunity, and it requires a lot of thinking. And then the future of transportation, I just put this in because I never see anyone talk about this. But actually in, I think, the Emirates or Dubai, you know, when you look at future mobility conferences, they've got personal autonomous flying devices. The reason I bring this in left field is that when we're thinking about the facades that go on our building structures, we're often thinking about what we're doing at street level. That's also an opportunity when we're bringing in the low carbon sort of structures and design, to be thinking, how do we make sure our buildings are future ready? So I've just drawn on a couple of examples to say we should be horizon scanning and thinking about all of these things in relation to net zero. So I've got just a couple more slides and then I'm ending. So I think there are fundamental contradictions we need to tackle in our sector to actually enable this huge transition. We're currently very reactionary, but actually thinking about net zero, thinking about climate change requires a precautionary approach. We tend to go towards simplification, but actually the challenge here is complexity, and we have amazing engineering and computational ability, and where we're going with digital twins really enables us to actually not shy away from that, but actually embrace that and actually plan with that. We're fragmented. We often acknowledge that ourselves and in various reviews. So how do we go about coordination, and how do we do that without relying on voluntary time, voluntary structures? It's a fundamental requirement in this sector now. Knowledge services. There's something now that it's a sort of servitization economy. But when it's a servitization economy, that means you can procure it, but you can also decide it's too much to procure, and it's a cost saving. So how do we go about working out how we evolve our fundamental core professional knowledge? And we work on project basis with innovation projects, with changes, but actually the mainstream is working on a program basis, and to deliver the kind of ambition we're looking at, we really need to think about how and the difficulties of scaling up projects into our mainstream structures. We have big problems with capital versus revenue, and I'll leave that so that you all know what I mean. We also have big problems with the hero story versus the learning story, and we will be experimenting. In the medical sector, they do clinical trials. We should be thinking about big scale building trials where we are very upfront with people that we are testing out some new technology, we're testing out new ways of doing things so that we can put our hands up and learn from it when it doesn't work. And lastly, we really need to think about what is the role of professional responsibility in all of this. So I'm aware that I've just put challenges out. I think there are solutions. I think we need to make space for sharing and making sense of new information. I think we need space for critical reflection. Future Build provides a space, a moment in time to do that, but we need far more time actually given to critical reflection so that we can actually really work on what we're doing. Sharing experiences, including what did not work, devising new operational procedures within rather than dictated to the sector. And we really need to bring peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and working out of the shadows. So this is my last slide. What we don't want to do is wait for another review and another verdict like this. Judith Hackett's findings mirror those of my PhD, which I've still got to finish writing up. And that was just on looking into fire alone. But you could look at this for low carbon, you could look at this for climate change resilience, you could look at this for producing healthy places in which we could all flourish in. So I think we've got the knowledge and capability in this country across all our different skill sets. But I really think as a built environment sector made up of many, many different professions, we need to be having far more frank conversations about how we're going to scale. Thank you.
That was good. Fantastic. I'm going to try to ask for a show of hands now, because I actually don't think we're in a transition for our industry. I think we're in a transformation, and that is quite upsetting, because you will suffer in the transition, which is really going to change your business. I'm going to show of hands. How many of you think we should actually try and meeting net zero carbon by 2050? That is only meeting the law. Okay, that's all that's doing, is meeting the law. How many thinks we should do something quicker than that, including the guy at the back? Okay. Anyone think we should just meet an unbelievably ambitious law, which is 2050 years? Just meet the law. Okay. As an industry, if you just try and meet the law, I have no interest in you. I have no interest in you. You're meant to be the leaders in something that is vital to society, our built environment. And we have professional bodies, we have professional qualifications, we have universities, some of the best in the world. And I've traded all over the world in construction and design. We have some of the best in the world. So I put it to you, actually it's not 2030, it's not the 80%. We should be aiming for a 60-month program, 60-month, 2025, to have practice embedded in the entire industry. From the contractor to the supplier to the manufacturer to the professional practice, to have net zero carbon, towards net zero carbon as an embedded large-scale practice. Now, if you do that in infrastructure, and I think you have 4 different industries actually here. You have infrastructure, stuff in the street. We're probably 10 years too late on that because of the cycle time of knowledge. How long has Crossrail been in design and construction? 25 years. You're not going to do it by 2030 if you're going to learn from it. So our cycle time of knowledge is a bit dodgy. So we're not going to get there on infrastructure. Buildings, cycle time of knowledge about 5 or 10 years. And you go through the other mega projects, nuclear, no learning cycle or nuclear at all. How do we actually address that in time? So if you accept you've got to have embedded practice in 60 months from now in order to get to an 80% reduction or beat it by 2030 and then look at 2050, you actually have to start doing different things. And the digital economy allows you to do that if you make a different offering to your clients. Now, building on the finance issue, I think the latest number for ESGs is about 39 trillion. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. In the capital market, the green bonds, ESGs, really nice, fantastic growth, irrelevant. The main capital market, where all the money is moving. And that's going to move in a dime. And when that arrives and says, I'm not going to finance your project because it's not sustainable or the climate change risk is too high, your client won't be able to raise money. And that could happen in weeks. And we're working on decades of learning. It doesn't work. We have to anticipate that will be there. We can't wait for legislation, and we can't wait for the money to have got there. It's going to be there. You now have clients like Microsoft declaring they're going to be negative carbon. You want to go and design a building for Microsoft? You better have a different offering. And you better have a different skill set, because that's what they want to buy. You want to work for Oxford, Manchester, Sheffield, the local authorities that are signed up, Berkeley Homes, Lend-Lease, BA still have a capital project. The London City Airport has a net zero carbon profile in their planning application. How are we servicing the clients who are demanding that today? It is not a convenient option to say it's what we normally do. The client has to tell me. We have to offer something that's different. And it won't be right. And I'd argue first thing to do not worry about the definition of net zero carbon. Just have one. And have a definition that's relevant to what you control. Don't pass it to the other person. that he or she will solve it. If you're doing something that's your core skill, change what you offer in your core skill. Have a definition that works. There's a guy I was talking to from National Trust, fantastically sophisticated discussion they've had internally about what they can control. It doesn't have to be right, and it doesn't have to be permanent. It can evolve. And if you're on something that's that radical, it will evolve. It will be different in 2 years' time. And you go, oh, that was interesting. We weren't perfect. You will not get to a perfect solution in your calculations, your offering, or any of the other skills you're going to try and put together, which, by the way, will need you to train your people and train your client in an issue that is beyond sustainability. It's the most complex thing you can possibly assimilate, climate change. The whole issue of climate change probability, the science involved, the social and economic impacts involved, the behavioral, the way we deal with risk, the way we avoid risk and deny it's not happening, the way we deal with all those issues are fundamentally different from anything else we've had to deal with as a society, and we are key to it as a built environment industry. It is a fantastic opportunity. I'd agree with Brian, fantastic opportunity. The money's going to be there, demanding that we have a different offering. The law is there in terms of a Climate Change Act telling you you've got to do it. And you've got school kids telling you that we've caused the problem and we're a bit late. So our opportunity is to change your offering. And if you change your offering, the first client may say no. That's okay, at least you made an offer. But you can't afford not to make the offer. Within 5 years, those that can't articulate that offer and give something towards a net zero carbon with a poor and immature calculation, with a poor and immature verification of it, because it will be, it's an evolving system, you won't be in business. Fantastic challenge. That's what competition is about. So don't wait for the client. Offer something. Don't wait for doing what you normally do. Change your question. And actually, as an industry, we have been terrible, and I've sort of run a few of these bits. We have never defined the question for clients. We wait for the client to tell us what to do. This is your opportunity to define the question. And in doing so, you will have to start hiring different skills. Because if you think you know how to do it now, you're going to make a fortune. You are really, really clever. Most of you are not there, and most practices are not there. So you have the ability now to change your model, to evolve your model, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Just a little note on cycle time. If you agree you're going to do something like this, you can get it wrong. You can get it wrong. That's what actually evolution of technology is about. It's about making mistakes. They're not fatal mistakes. There will be construction, there will be actually technology dead ends. That's fine as long as you assimilate quickly. What we can't do is say, we're going to experiment with a building. Great investment. It takes us a year to design it. It takes us 18 months to build it. It takes us 3 seasons to collect the data. Oh, that's interesting. I've learned some lessons. I'm going to fold that back in. There's no time left. There's no time left. That was fine 20 years ago when we kind of thought this is the end of the century issue. It is no longer the end of the century issue. And if you want a working rule of thumb for this, just put a discount rate on your carbon. So just price for your own workings when you offer clients, just assume every ton of carbon is $400 and discount it at 25% over 4 years to it's $100 in 4 or 5 years' time. So every ton you save today is worth a lot more than a ton saved in 4 or 5 years' time. That's the point of climate change. It's a structural issue. Stuff we put up now is more difficult and more expensive to get out later. Look at Lord Stern's report 2006. Every year's delay doubles the cost of solving it. So this is not about what your performance is in 2030 or 2050, it's what you're offering tomorrow, because it's more valuable tomorrow than it is back then. And all the climate change models, all the scenarios, have to have the built environment being radically decarbonized. There is no option on it. There is no option. We've left it too late. So don't do resilience. Last thing I'll say is resilience is fantastic. It's for the rich. Adaptation is for the rich. We will protect our assets. London will be fine. We're screw hull. That's the way it works. That's not moral. So adaptation and resilience without mitigation is immoral, and arguably under the Climate Change Act should be illegal. But as professional people, offering resilience of infrastructure without mitigating it, without reducing radically its carbon, not just keeping it at the same level, is actually immoral. And that gives you the opportunity to make a different offering and a different way of putting together your service to your clients. I think that's it. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what you all thought about those presentations, but the territory covered in the last three-quarters of an hour was absolutely huge. I have got a list of questions for each of them, but I've just torn them up because actually you're all here. It's a big crowd. We want to hear what what really struck a chord with you and how you want to clarify some of the things that were said, bearing in mind we've got to do it differently now. So, let's have some hands up for questions. 1 and 2 we'll take right at the beginning. And get some others ready, please. Yeah. And then there was one further forward.
My name is Günther Jedliczka, ÖAD Housing Office Vienna. We build student dorms in passive house construction and zero energy student dorms now for more than 15 years. That's our main business. But my statement or my question is to the panel, if we do not change our monetary and financial system, I think we do not succeed in fighting climate change. We have alternatives in Austria, so if anyone is interested in that topic, come to the Austrian booth afterwards. Thank you.
Good, and there was another question further forward. We'll take them in pairs.
My question actually closely links to that. I used to be a quantity surveyor and still work in the construction industry, and I think it's, unfortunately, the drivers are the people on site who are making the decisions, and every single project I go on, there's always more that can be done. What is the drive that's coming from government? Where is the funding going to... You were mentioning in the last section about the changes there, the money's going to be there for these investments, and we've got to offer a change for the client, but the client will always take the most cost-effective, value-engineered option. So it'd be interesting to hear what's actually coming that's going to change that.
Thank you. Greg, I think you're the first one. What's got to change in terms of the financial system? And then maybe Keith might want to say something about this too.
I missed, say it again, I couldn't hear the question. What's the question?
The question is, have we got to change the financial system? Can we? And the second one is, where is the driver? But let Greg have it first.
I'll do the financial system.
Hang on. Let Greg go first.
Oh, okay.
I don't mind, Keith. Yeah. I was going to say, you're quite right. There are loads of challenges, and we work in a fragmented industry. It is very challenging when you've got a spec developer that is building a commercial building that is going to flip that building to the secondary market as soon as they possibly can once they've got an anchor tenant, if the secondary market want to buy it. And if the secondary market do not want to buy anything that's not driving down to... Because we're talking about pension funds here, our money. If they don't want to buy assets that are assets for a short period of time, in my view, before they become stranded assets and liabilities, then that's going to change the mindset of those spec developers, because they've got no one to sell their product to. And then that will drive a difference on site. We need to see it happen. It's our money. Ask where your own pension's invested. What are they doing? And that links back into sort of this disclosure on climate-related risk that is massively coming from the 1st of April, where all of the signatories to something called the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, 2,400 financial institutions have got to disclose where that money's going and how those risks are being managed.
Okay, Keith, briefly, financial system.
In the sustainability world, there's always been an argument, and still is, that the free market capitalism does not work for society. And you can argue that's true or not, and we've had some massive failures. However, the idea that we're going to change globally the socio-economic system in any significant way to deal with climate change is not going to happen. So you are going to have a single-party state in China. You're going to have America being whatever America is with its free market economy, and you're going to have Europe with something in between, and they're the context which we're going to have to deal with climate change. There's simply no time for a social political revolution of fundamental orders of society for the entire globe. And I don't see it happening in the UK. We've swung to the right. We have issues now of people funding, significant funding for climate deniers, dressing it up. This is a major issue. So you've got to deal with the cards you've got. And the free market, with all its faults, can be played. And there are some big changes, as has been said. Pension funds now have an obligation, whereas before they had a prohibition of looking at climate risk. Whereas before they could only look at returns for their pensioners. Now they actually can include risk of climate change. That changes the way the world works, but it doesn't change the fundamental system.
Okay.
There's an example. So if you come along to the session at 4 p.m. later today, we will have Derwent London and HSBC talking partly about the green REITs. So that's a revolving credit facility against green finance principles. So it's already coming, it's already happening. The green finance sector wants to work with you to innovate, but you need to be able to step up.
I want to ask Jim a slightly sideways question, which is related to this, which is how big an opportunity is COP26 in Glasgow, and where should we be applying our pressure on government in order to get the most out of it?
Yeah. So, huge opportunity. I think one thing, well, apart from the false start for the government's preparations, the one challenge for it is it's quite hard to define an overall goal for that COP, you know, like we had at Paris, which was 1.5 degrees. For this one, clearly we want countries to up their ambition, but I think from the purposes of, you know, people in this room, in a way, we need to start thinking about coalitions of non-state actors, whether they're councils, organisations, whatever, who are increasingly making these very ambitious pledges to put pressure on government and say, actually, within the built environment, we want a coalition of the willing, and you can use your power and your influence at COP to get that together, not just nationally, but internationally. So previously, the UK government has done it on coal. They had something called the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I'd like to see, you know, Sorting Out Building Alliance or something like that, you know, with a better title, obviously. But we can do things like that, and I think we have an opportunity this year to do more of that sort of thing.
Great. Okay, more questions, please. 1, 2 here, and then I'll come to the back. And I'd like some women, please.
Reducing, if I want to reduce my carbon footprint, but I want to choose how I do it, flying, personal transport, home heating, is there a method of trade-off? Do we have enough measuring sticks for the carbon output of these different activities to say, I'm going to up one and down the other? I'm going to ban my car, I'm going to clamp down at home, and I'm going to have one flight a year.
Okay, got it.
For that?
Got it.
On a couple of your early presentations, there was a timeline of towards net zero, which included carbon capture and storage.
Yeah.
Being that this has been proposed as a bit of a magic bullet for many years, and at least in the last 15 years I've worked in sustainability, I just wondered at this stage how viable that is, whether it's really ready to go and the scale needed.
Claire, that's 2 for you.
Do you want to do
You go first.
You go first.
Yeah. Okay. So on that trade-off, I don't. There must be carbon footprinting down to personal sort of choices. But I just wanted to mention something called the Mackay calculator. So anyone who was familiar with the global calculator that our Department for Energy and Climate Change produced maybe 5 years ago was the first time where we actually understood on a global scale the trade-off between some of these choices that we needed to make, like heating our homes versus our travel. And that was the first time that the understanding of diet as a choice came into, into that understanding of balance. And so it's now down to country scale with something called the Mackay calculator after David Mackay, and it's coming. It's being sort of honed down to smaller scale. But anyway, it's an online tool that you can look at, and I just think that from an educational perspective or city scale, it is a pretty awesome tool. So
Great.
Quite honest.
Okay, carbon capture. Yeah, you want to do something?
I don't want to say too much on it because I'm not an expert
okay.
on it, but I'd say that it is expensive at the moment. I think it's something that we put in the mix, but there's no silver bullet. The real answer is using the energy hierarchy and dropping our demand for energy and carbon. That's the first thing we've got to do.
Okay, Jim.
I mean, I think unfortunately carbon capture is inescapable in a net zero world. I wish it wasn't, but because thermodynamically it's a tough sell and it's a cost, and there's a lot of cost involved. I would say that unlike some magic bullets, this unicorn does actually exist. In North America there are large-scale demonstration projects now up and running, storing carbon and capturing it. There's one in Norway, there's one in Australia, so it has been done. But at the moment the costs are high, and I think the UK and a number of other countries just have to bite the bullet and start rolling out that infrastructure and see if we can bring that cost down. But I don't see any way around it really in a net zero world.
Okay, I want to pick up on the trade-off thing. How many people in the audience measure their annual carbon footprint, personal carbon footprint? I would expect it to be 3/4 of the room. The calculators exist, and until you measure your own footprint, you don't know the impact of a flight. You don't know the impact of the heat. And it's not scoring points, it's actually understanding the impact that you're having. Okay, a couple more questions. One here, and then the one at the back.
Hi, we are very small developers, and I suppose really my question is, how do we get into the sort of mix of understanding and putting our little sort of ideas forward? It's not something that's easy for it to do. There's lots of big industry here.
It's a really good question. And the one at the back there, and I'll come to you later. No, the one, oh, okay. Come.
Okay, thank you. I'm an MSc student at UCL, Construction Economics, and actually my question is, we've spoke about how planners, developers, even in the finance sector, how we can influence this achievement of net zero. However, at the personal level, Energy Act of 2011, where the government actually was encouraging the public to reduce emission and also to work on renovating their houses. Where are we within that sector? Do we consider that there's much work to do on construction that was already built? And another question with data that concerning innovation and technology in the built environment, we're only at 1.6% of improvement comparing to a 3% in manufacturing and an average of 2.6 in all of industry. That's according to a McKinsey report. How much are we really ambition in achieving innovation within the construction industry and the built environment?
Okay, right. Small builder. Who wants to go for it, Greg?
Yep. Speaking from experience here, so I've worked with big companies.
Sorry, developer.
HSBC and those sorts of guys, very big companies. And then now I'm working with a very small CIC, 6 people. And we're doing developments. Because you can get a long way there with very simple mechanisms. The key being, the fabric of the building. So, what's your air tightness? Let's start there. What's the thermal performance? They're the real key starting points. The building regs is air tightness of 10. We can look to massively improve on that through quality of construction. And actually, when you look at SMEs, number one, they're much more efficient than big companies. And number two, there's loads of really good examples of really good, high quality builds by SMEs. And then it's looking at making sure we don't make it too airtight. If we do, then we need to put in some mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, and those sorts of things. But we can get a long way there without it actually costing more. But you're putting forward to the market an improved product. So I think it's a really, really great opportunity at the end of the market.
Retrofit, anyone? Yeah, go for it. I did think it was missing from your big
okay.
picture.
Yeah, so one of the things we're doing under this coalition is doing pro bono, a piece of work with government, looking at the decarbonisation of heat pathways. So bookend, one end, hydrogen, what does that mean? Hydrogen boilers, the other end, electrification, heat pumps. But both of them include mass scale energy efficiency of homes because that's necessary. More necessary with heat pumps, but generally if you're going to have to retrofit somebody's house with upgraded electrical systems or hydrogen boilers, there's the opportunity to go in and improve the energy efficiency. So the timeline we're looking at involves that. How fast can we make that happen? And I think the point is, this now is going to hurt. So all the previous times it was maybe a nice to have and we were knocking on the door saying, please tighten regulation. Now, if this legal target is going to happen, this thing is going to happen. It's going to ramp up. So that might be a bit of an optimistic view, but I think the lens has changed.
Okay, very quickly, something about innovation.
Our industry has, in large parts, no innovation. The structure of the industry between design consultants, contractors at cash positive, i.e. other people's money, to subcontractors and manufacturers, actually does not lend itself to innovation. And we can see that. The innovation and the IP is virtually solely in the manufacturers, not in the process side. Now, that's a sort of structural issue that's not going to survive. And the future, which digital design and the digitization of our industry, which is going to happen whether you like it or not, actually, changes the industry, which is why it will be more disruptive than you probably realize. And if you can't actually do a design that incorporates the manufacturing and specialist subcontractors into your early concept design, you basically can't do high-performance buildings. When we've done it, you've merged those two. The main contractor in the middle is squeezed out. It's a different design process. If you have a different design process, the technology and IP that sits on these stands can be incorporated in your design. Otherwise, you're left at people doing value engineering at the wrong point. And that we know does not work, which is why we killed 70 people in a high-rise fire. So we are an industry that's fundamentally failed, either in innovation or in competency. And that's pretty sad, given the quality of people we've got, which is pretty damn good. But the structure has failed.
Okay, there's lots of questions. We'll have the first one there, and then one with the gentleman standing there. They'll probably be the last, but we'll see how we go.
Okay. The government has announced that by the mid-2020s they're committed to building 300,000 houses a year. They've released a consultation paper on how purchasers are not satisfied with their homes, and it's about snagging. There's nothing really being done, I don't see, to make builders build energy-efficient homes. How do you propose that the government sort of gets to grips with that?
Good question. Next one.
Jeff Beacon from the Pollution Tax Association. The National Planning Policy Framework has signed up to sustainability through reference to a United Nations resolution. If you're a motorist, and look up how bad are bananas, you find you burst that fair remaining carbon budget in just a few years for 1.5 degrees, and just a little bit more for 2 degrees. Does this mean that building for motorists is against the NPPF and therefore illegal and should be banned?
Okay, there's loads of things to talk about here. I don't know what, Jim, you want to say, or Claire, you talked about land use a bit, and there is a land use dimension to this. Do you want to say the motorist? And then the question about, and it links to the 200,000 houses, and how the hell are you going to build them without any public transport?
So I think on the motorist side, I think it's about increased use of scenario planning in policy, and I can see through some of the discussions that we're having with the things like the Department for Transport, that they are recognising that they need to build in carbon as a layer of their decision making that's never really happened before. So So those are the sorts of pieces of work. I think that's where it starts with some of these things, which is maybe a bit of a cop-out answer, but...
Okay. Jim, do you want to say anything?
Well, just to add on that, I guess the main challenge is really, certainly for surface transport, is switching to low-carbon vehicles. I mean, of course, part of that is how far we travel, which is to do with the planning and how we design towns and cities. But I think, you know, like Claire, I agree. Department of Transport seems to have finally got it. You know, they had a 2040 target. As soon as that Road to Zero was published, they realised it was out of date and inadequate. Then they've been working on something else. But yeah, we shouldn't just focus on the vehicle, of course. But, you know, the planning is important too. But that operates over a longer timescale. So the faster we get polluting cars off the roads, cleaner cars on the roads, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, that's it, I'm afraid. It breaks my heart in a way. There's so many of you here. There's so much to discuss. I'm sure that the panel aren't going to run away, so if you want to talk to them afterwards, I'm sure they'd be very happy to. There's three things I was going to think about what you can do. First of all is, you heard quite a lot about voluntary efforts, voluntary organisations, pro bono, and whether that's good or bad. I think we all need to engage in this now, and finding the right body is one thing. The second is, your local authorities almost certainly are signing up and developing their strategies, and so you've all got councillors, you've all got members. You need to make sure that they're pointing in the right direction, and you're going to push them and help them when you can. And the third one is, if you're lucky enough to have a pension, make sure your independent financial advisor is decarbonising it now. So, with that, can you thank the panel?